Hi everyone, welcome to this interview workshop. We're going to be talking about Arts and Humanities interviews here at Cambridge. My name's Tess, I'm the School Liaison Officer here at Magdalene College. So first of all, these are the ambassadors we have working today, and they're going to be helping answer some of the sample questions. So I'll be calling on them as and when we get the sample questions. Obviously, we're trying to cover a range of subjects here. Apologies, we haven't got every Cambridge subject mentioned here. We'll try and cover as many as possible, and I've got lots of sample questions as well that will cover other subjects, such as like architecture, and I'll point those out when we get to them. So number one, why do we actually interview at Cambridge? So we receive a lot of really high quality applications every year. And the interviews allow us to get to know you a bit better before making an assessment just on things like, your predicted grades and your personal statement. We want to actually meet you and see how you think and talk through questions. Um, it's just we have more data about you, so we can narrow down the candidates better. So the interviews show us how you think and how you respond to being challenged, if you would actually enjoy and benefit from the way that we teach. So at Cambridge, we have the supervisions here, which is like small group teaching. We have a lot of discussion-based teaching here. So the interview shows us, your skills are suited to that. We also want to hear about your interests, about your personal kind of connection to the subject, and if that aligns with how we are going to teach you here and what is covered in your course. And what will the format of the interviews be? Most candidates will have two interviews. They'll be approximately 25 minutes long, might be 30 minutes long. Some subjects might only have one interview, and typically that will be longer. So more than, for example, in music, we only have one interview, and that's about 45 minutes long to kind of make up for the fact that you're not having two interviews. We make the one a bit longer. Typically, you'll have two interviewers in each interview. These will be people who are academics in that subject. So they might be fellows. That means that they kind of belong to that college. Or they might be kind of guest people they've brought in who lecture in that subject, who are maybe PhD students. But they'll all be studying they'll all have got a qualification in that subject to be teaching at the university. Now, this year, a lot of interviews are taking place online at Cambridge. There are a couple of colleges that have them in person instead. Now, the format should not differ. They should ask you very similar questions. They are looking for the same thing. The questions shouldn't really change. The only thing that will be different is that you'll be doing it over Zoom, so you can be, in the comfort of your own home or at school, or you could be at Cambridge and be in an office. Now, I know a lot of people think about Cambridge offices as some kind of like quite intimidating places, these big armchairs, these kind of scary looking offices. That's not the case. If you see here a photo I've included from our history director of studies office, it might just be an office like this. So there'll be a couple of chairs, maybe a table, a sofa, and it's very familiar. It'll probably look very similar to a room that you have at school. So what do we actually look for? We want you to have a really deep curiosity for your subject and actually like your subject. Flexibility of thinking and readiness to change your mind. This doesn't mean that you have no opinion. It just means that if you're being challenged, if somebody's offering a counter argument, you're not just being stubborn and sticking to your guns. You can pick up on new ideas and adapt based on the information you're given. So I think it's that flexibility, but it's not being, too like fickle. It's a bit of a middle ground. We also want you to have quite a lot of critical and creative solutions and ability to draw connections. They might give you, say, a text or a source, and they might say, how does this relate to something you've read before? How does this relate to something you're doing in your A levels? So it's about connecting different texts, different pieces of information, making those links, doing that comparison maybe as well. We want you to have really great elaborated knowledge of the topics mentioned in your application. So this will be the topics mentioned in your personal statement, or if you say submitted some written work. We can use that in the interview. So if you've mentioned things in your personal statement, they might form the basis of the questions at interview. If you've written some written work about, say, a play or about, political like theory that you like, if you're applying for something like HSBS, they might pick up on that in interview. So make sure you know your written work, you know your personal statement. If you've talked about things like an EPQ in your personal statement, you should know that quite well, and be prepared for any questions to come up on those topics. Autonomous thinking that goes beyond the school syllabus is also important. So this means you're not just kind of parroting back what your teachers say. It's not the case that the only things you've read in your subject are the things you've done in school, but you are exploring that subject outside of school as well. You have your own opinions. You've read some different perspectives than what your teacher or your school syllabus tells you is correct. Now, in the interview itself, you might get asked to, say, engage in contemporary debates in that subject. This again will be more relevant for subjects maybe like geography or economics or HSBS. Might be relevant for something like architecture. Um, Respond to some pre-reading or visual sources. So visual sources might be for, say, history of art or architecture, things like anthropology maybe, or archaeology. You might get given an image. It could be in history as well. Pre-reading might be for, say, something like English or history or MML. They might give you a text in a different language. Um, and typically, you'll have been told about this if you've got your invite to interview, or say you've got 30 minutes pre-reading or 10 minutes pre-reading. That is where you have time to analyze this source before you go into your interview. Now, then, in the interview, they'll ask you a few questions about what you thought about that text, and that will form some of the interview, like kind of questions. Now, you might also, yeah, like I said, be asked to expand on topics mentioned in your personal statement, so do read over that. So what are we not looking for? We don't need you to have an encyclopedic knowledge of everything, especially not everything in your course. We know that those courses are really, really broad, and you probably like certain modules better than others. So we don't expect you to know everything. It's about being passionate about things that you like and having that somewhat deeper knowledge because you've read things outside of school, but you don't need to know every single fact about everything. Don't be scared that you might not know a certain definition. That's okay. We don't want completely like controversial opinions without any analytical justification. Some people think like having a shock factor makes you sound impressive, makes you stand out. I think if you can't analyze that, if you can't justify it, um, it's not really worth it. So just make sure that if you're making a bold claim, you have some justification as to why you're making that, and you can show us that train of thought as how you got there. Um, Now, you'll often be told who your interviewers are. You'll get their names when you get emailed your invite to interview. And you might go and Google them and you might see that they write about a certain thing or they like a certain area. Don't just parrot back what you think they want to hear. If you're interviewing for English and you realize that the people interviewing you are all people who study modernist literature, you might not like modernist literature, and don't try and make the interview about that just to try and please them. Just think this is what they want to hear, this is what they might agree with. Like that's not your passion. We don't want you to have knowledge of an area that's not really your passion. We want you to kind of show us why you're curious about that subject. So don't overcomplicate it and think too much about what your interviewers want you to say. Parroting of others' ideas is a very similar point. Just because your teachers like a certain thing, or just because you've read certain things, maybe when you're doing some deeper reading, doesn't mean that is always the correct answer. Um, and then, yeah, name dropping of concepts, theories, academics, books, without being able to discuss them in depth. We want to see that deep, thinking and that analytical justification. We don't just want you to drop something because we might say, oh, this academic, tell us about, the works that you like. And you could dig yourself into a bit of a hole there. So just be very, very careful. If you are going to name drop things that you can actually talk about them at length. So I'm going to move on to some sample questions now. And the first one I'm going to get Jennifer to answer because Jennifer studies art history. And I'm going to do the one that is the written word more valuable than visual images? So Jennifer, over to you.
Is to kind of pick out a word to try and approach it. So I would probably focus first of all on the term valuable. So firstly, for example, you could consider kind of historical value. So that might include monetary value as well. So for example, ideologically, written word was more valuable in periods such as the Renaissance. So where text began to be used as kind of the theoretical basis for the visual arts. And you had artists such as Van Eyck who would begin including words into kind of frames to make a broader commentary on kind of what he considered to be the almost wrongfully higher value of words. So, and that came from kind of a Rousseau idea in the written word being an intellectual rather than a kind of mechanical art, which is what you would find in the visual arts. You could also think about kind of the rhetorical value or kind of the impact on different groups of people. So, for example, the written word is obviously a very powerful tool of rhetoric. So, kind of highly valued in that way, whereas you also had images that were used kind of in their own right among the elite and everyday people, such as you had kind of Napoleonic war scenes and kind of his victories in battle that were massively exaggerated, and that was used as a really powerful tool of propaganda. And then you could maybe consider kind of the impact on the everyday person. I think a good way about thinking about these questions is kind of considering different groups of people. And I think that's pretty widely applicable for lots of the humanities. So you could think about kind of the higher value of religious art in terms of a didactic sense. So in the Middle Ages, where you had a majority kind of illiterate population, obviously art is maybe going to have a higher value in terms of rhetorically in that way than the written word because it simply impacts a broader variety of people. And then you could think as well about for my subject, history of art, obviously the kind of formal and material value. So, for example, the power to immortalize people, which you can't really find in the written word. So, that type of value where a visual image can simulate life, obviously, in a more sensory way. Whereas you could argue that with the written word, you're prompting more a mental image, which you could then argue lessens its value. And then you could also think about kind of clarity and ambiguities. So you could maybe argue that visual images lead to more ambiguities despite their kind of direct depictions because they allow for more varied interpretations because obviously it's a more open dialogue in terms of communication because anyone can look at an image and have their own interpretations, whereas not everyone can read the same language. So, in terms of the written word, so you could argue that either increased or diminished value. But those are just a few different ways you could think about the question.
Thank you. And in an interview, would somebody then come back to you and argue against you? Do you think you'd have a bit of a debate about this? How long would you maybe spend on a question like this?
I think with a question like this, yes, you would probably have an interviewer come back on a few things that I said, or kind of push me on a certain point. So, for example, if an interviewer wanted to take it in more of a historical or social direction, then they might pick up on one of the first things I said, or ask me in more depth about a particular period and maybe how that changed. So, I think with questions like this, I think, to be honest, it could take up like almost an entire interview if that's what the interviewer decided to focus on, but it would just be taken in different directions. So it get kind of more and more in depth.
Thanks. I've just realised I didn't introduce the other Isabella. So we've got Isabella O, who studies history, and I was wondering if you would be able to have a go at answering what can't historians find out about the past?
Yeah, so I'm a first year historian. And I think when you approach this question, it's more about what they can't. So you say about the ephemeral ways of studying history. So there's like like the senses. So you could talk about smell, things like that that can't be recorded in other ways other than perceptions. So you could talk about bias, but I think an important part is whenever you mention things like bias, you mention how whilst everyone has a bias, you can be analytical in it and it can be useful. So instead of just pointing out, oh, it's biased, so it's inherently wrong, um, you would say that it's useful to find out different interpretations of it. But also what things you can't find out about the past, it would be internal emotions. So you could find out about an autobiography, what someone's claiming their motivations to be, but that won't show inherently because most people don't know themselves how they think about things.
Thank you. Um, Ashley, for the nationalism one, is nationalism always a bad thing? How would you go about answering that one?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. Um, we should start by defining our terms, and in this case, which is nationalism. And by defining the term, of course, you can give your intuitive idea of what nationalism may entail, but I would recommend to think about different perspectives of nationalism, just like how the way we define like the value question. Yeah, so nationalism contains civic nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and in a specific context, anti-colonial nationalism, and also like everyday term nationalism. And after you define the term clearly, you can set up the context and set up your argument. You can acknowledge the intuitive harm argument. For example, like some forms of nationalism do produce hierarchical, racialized identities and may even, as a way to justify violence, or suppressed minorities. You can think of you can like borrow theories and incorporate them in your response. But as the suggestion also has already said, do not name dropping, do not do name dropping. Just use their ideas wisely and to help you build your own arguments. And next, you can try to think about like introduce the possible goods of nationalism. And this is where a strong HSPS argument or like social science argument overall would stand out. You can draw on comparative politics, you can draw on sociology and political theory. For example, political legitimacy. Benedict Anderson in his book, The Imagined Community, is talking about how this would allow a large-scale cooperation. And nationalism may also do good to democratic accountability, anti-colonial liberation, and even welfare solidarities. And a key tip I would give to potential candidates applying for social sciences is that you should specify the conditions under which nationalism may be good, may be bad, may turn harmful, may turn beneficial for the society, for people, for politicians. Yes. And overall, they're not expecting a very logical, very coherent argument. They're really testing how you think about this issue, how you approach the question from your perspectives. And they want to see that you are very aware of perspectives taking and you're aware of complexity of the issue. Yeah, that's the overall recommendations, I would say.
Yeah, and I think what you've all done is approached it very critically and said in this kind of angle, Isabella, you was talking about like bias, how sometimes bias can be used in a good way and a bad way. It's not just having one set track, but approaching the question from quite a broad angle and saying maybe arguing both sides of debate there. And yeah, like you were saying, Ashley, if you set the terms already, then your argument looks a bit stronger because you're saying I'm approaching it from this way and this is how I'd answer it. If I was to take it this way instead, this is how I'd answer it. I think you come more at it from a stronger perspective. Now, Poppy, I'm actually going to ask you a question that's not on here because we were discussing this earlier. This is a question that has been asked, not just for languages, but in many subjects before by our languages DOS. If a language was a city, what would that look like? So, Poppy, I was wondering if you could have a go at answering that one.
So this is one of my sort of favorite types of questions that they might ask you in an interview. It's possible that you might get something like this sort of towards the end of an interview where they're really testing to see sort of how you cope with something that might seem potentially a bit irrelevant or sort of very much out of your comfort zone. But this type of question, they are absolutely not asking for a sort of there is absolutely no right answer here. Sort of echoing what everyone else already said, it's all in how you approach it. So personally for me, I'm imagining, so if a language was a city, not quite in the same level of detail as setting up your terms as maybe some other sort of more specific questions, but you can say, okay, well, I imagine a city to be a place where people live, as well as a physical place, a physical space where there are sort of public services and buildings, and it's very much a function and it has a very human element to it. So I'm sort of setting up my terms there. And then I'm imagining if I'm applying the word language to the word city, that means naturally that there is, that a language is this sort of interrelation between people and function, and sort of everyday life. So to me then, this is sort of where it's asking you to sort of take the creative route, once you've sort of established those things. So at that point, I would probably say something along the lines of, each sort of part of language has its own function that it performs in that system. So for example, maybe you imagine nouns to be different buildings within this city, places where people live, train stations, or maybe other shops, etc. And then you can sort of, well, this is just one of many ways you could approach this question. So for me, logically next would make sense to say, verbs would be modes of transport. So I'm sort of imagining a city with trains and buses as verbs, creating motion. So really with a question like this, what you can do is sort of show your creative side at the same time as showing that you have a really good understanding of some of the things they're asking you to consider. So for a language-based question, that might be sort of knowledge of functions of different parts of language. So you can really build on that, and I don't know, you can say a lot of things just with such a simple question, or even say sort of conjunctions, for example. So I'm imagining words like and, but, so, to be, transport hubs, train stations, etc. So really, what they're asking here is not so much we know what a language would look like if it was a city. Really, what they're asking you to do is, again, sort of define your terms and work out where the link is between those two terms, and then just be creative with it and have fun with it. Yeah, to sort of, I think it's a really great way that they might try and sort of engage you beyond something that you would necessarily sort of usually think about.
Yeah, I think this kind of question is very much about how you think and how you approach questions and yeah, how your brain works rather than getting the right answer. Now, over Isabella, I'm going to ask you to answer this one because some subjects do have graph questions, maybe more common in something like geography, land economy. I've known people have graphs in HSBS, sometimes in history, just as a source. So I was wondering if you would be able to talk through this and how you'd approach this with these kind of questions at the bottom.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as Tess said, it's quite common to have graphs, and then also, especially for geography, you might potentially have maps. So in terms of the graph that's displayed here, I'd recommend looking for either peaks or troughs within the data, and then trying to think what potentially correlates with those. So, why is there a peak in the mid 1940s? You could potentially link that to World War II. You just have to think about the wider context of it. Sorry, Tess, I can't see the PowerPoint on my screen. So sorry if you read out the questions to me,
Yeah,
just
of
so I
course.
can.
Number one is please interpret this graph. Number two is do you think carbon dioxide should be used as a main metric in understanding climate change, e.g., 420 ppm?
Okay,
And the last one is limitations of considering emissions at a global scale.
Okay, great. So with regards to the second question, if you're not familiar with it, it's like 420 parts per million, and that's a common metric which is used to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So with that, that's often used in COP, and it's quite a commonly and wide understood quantifier, but you could potentially consider other things like what if we consider sea level rise, or if we consider methane emissions. And then moving on to the final question, I think it's really important to consider like who does it leave out? And you have to look at an average as constituting everyone. And as a result, it obviously omits responsibility. And I think, as previous people have said, you just need to kind of define what terms you're approaching this on. You can say like it omits responsibility in the current, or it omits historic responsibility of historic emissions. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And obviously something for HSBS, something for history would maybe not look like this. They would not expect you to be able to understand CO2 in the same way that a geographer would. So it would be relevant to your subject, but I'm just saying it won't necessarily just be questions or pre-reading. It might include looking at a graph or a source and being able to pick out data. So like Isabella said, looking at peaks and troughs, it might be that there are things redacted. So sometimes I've seen that they've had graphs, but they've not included which country this is from. So you kind of need to think, is this like a Western place? Is this how we're interpreting it? And maybe being able the trick is about being able to spot the redacted data, and that's kind of what they're testing you to see what you need to consider to be able to interpret the graphs or the sources they're giving you. And now I don't actually have an English student here, but I wanted to give you an example of what an extract could be. So if you would say apply for something like English, they might give you a poem to read and they might give you 20 minutes. It might come with a question. So here I've said, is there a sense of threat in this poem? And you would be able to analyze this. Like I said, some colleges might allow you to print it out if that was in the instructions. And you analyze it very similar to what you do in your unseen poetry at A level or at GCSE. This is relevant for also things like history. They often have pre-reading, HSBS sometimes. Quite a lot of essay subjects do have pre-reading, and I'll ask the ambassadors if they had it and how they approached it as well in a bit. So what are some common misconceptions about the interview? You don't have to get every question right. As we've already kind of shown you, a lot of questions don't even have a right answer. It's more about how you think, and we want to see that thinking. We don't just want you to kind of sit in silence and then give us the correct answer. We want you to talk through how you're getting there, like we said, define those terms and set out the approach you're going with, and then say, if you've changed your mind already, if you kind of get yourself dig a hole for yourself, you say, actually, I want to kind of think back. I've realized this isn't going to go the way I wanted it to, so I would approach it now from this way. So talk through that process so we understand how your brain works. You shouldn't really be asked obscure questions. And if you think they are a bit obscure, a bit like that one that Poppy was saying about if language was a city, maybe it's more open. It's about how you would interpret the question as opposed to there being a right answer. And if it seems really obscure, you do not understand what they're asking, you are completely allowed to ask for clarification. You can say, could you rephrase this differently? Could you explain what you mean by this term? You're allowed to ask them for clarification rather than just go straight in trying to answer it when you don't really know what they're asking you to say. In terms of like logistics, practicalities, you don't need to dress in a certain way. A lot of you will be doing your interview during the school hours, so you might be just doing it at school and be in a separate room if you're doing it online. So feel free to wear your school uniform if you have one. But if you're doing it at home, you can wear whatever you like. Whatever you think will make you feel comfortable in an interview, will get you in the right headspace, just wear that. And you don't have to hide things like your accent or your mannerisms. They're not the kind of things that we're assessing you on. It'll be nice, just to speak clearly so we can understand what you're saying, but really don't worry about things like your accent or mannerisms or your personality. We're trying to see if you would be a good fit for us to teach, so you don't need to kind of hide who you are. I mentioned that you'll get information about your interviewer. Don't feel like you need to research them and know about their careers. I saw somebody post on TikTok the other week that they were a law student they were applying for law last year, and once they got their invite to interview, they decided to read their interviewer's PhD work and kind of know the ins and outs of their interviewer's research, and it made them exhausted. And they didn't get in because they were kind of over prepared. They had rehearsed answers. They were trying to bring up things that weren't relevant to what they were asking. So I wouldn't go too in depth with what your interviewer's research interests are. Just think about what you like instead. You will most likely be asked if you want to ask a question at the end. They'll say, do you have any questions for us? And I think don't ask one if you don't genuinely have one. This is a really good opportunity for you to ask a question about your subject. You're sat there with two experts in your field. You hopefully like that field. So go ahead and ask one if you genuinely have a query. But otherwise, there's no need to ask a question. We're not judging you on this. And then finally, the interview is not the only thing that's important. A lot of people will do kind of not as well at the interview, but we'll look back at things like maybe if you've done an admissions test. So, like for English, you might have done one today. For some architecture, we'll look back at your personal statement. We'll look at your teacher reference and your predicted grades, and it all forms part of a holistic process. So, don't think if you come out of that interview and you think that went horrifically, don't think that's the end of the road for you. You might still get an offer. And a lot of the time, because there aren't right or wrong answers anyway, you might not know if you did well in the interview or not. You just have to kind of leave the interview and try and forget about it until you get that offer or unfortunately maybe that rejection in January. So I'm going to put these up, but I'm also going to ask the ambassadors if you have any advice on how to prepare for the interviews or maybe talk about what you did to prepare. So anyone who feels free to say anything, please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add on the third point. Read over your personal statement, any written work in advance. Really be prepared that one of the interviews, at least for me, like is dominated by questions regarding your personal statement and written work, and that necessarily means any theories, any books, opinions you mentioned in your personal statement, you can elaborate on them. You can give out any more examples, more empirical evidence, and yeah, just make sure what you wrote is from your heart and you can just be prepared to answer them. And also, with regards to the current affairs, try to focus on trying to give out your own opinions, although be mindful of like putting forward very controversial opinions without clarifications, without analytical justifications. But you can also be very opinionated if you can support it with a clear lines of reasoning. They don't want a literature review. They want an actual and lively person who gives out opinions and justify their opinions.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely know that personal statement. And yeah, I think that's great advice, Ashley. Can Anybody else got any advice, especially if it's relevant to your subject?
I
Uh,
have good. Sorry, Jennifer.
it's okay. You can go.
Okay. I have a good thing of what not to do. This or sort of this kind of thing might not actually help you. The night before my interview, I knew I was going to be given pre-reading, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I decided that it was a good idea in a panic to try and sort of analyze, sort of as an unseen test, something along the lines of maybe 15 to 20 French poems. Was a really bad idea. It just made me feel more stressed. Please don't do that. It's a really valuable exercise to practice the kind of thing you might have in advance, but don't do that. And then I think in terms of what you should do for preparation, I think, yeah, as Ashley was saying, just make sure you have sort of really thought about what you've already said. And I think also what I find really important now in my course as well, is being prepared to make links between things that you already know and new information, or linking to things that you already know about and linking them together. I think also being prepared, being prepared for the unexpected. I studied Russian from scratch, and it's quite a weird interview if you're sort of studying a new language. They sort of gave us an exercise which was essentially a made up language, and sort of took us through some exercises to see how we could interpret sort of how that would function. And honestly, my best advice with that is to just prepare to remain very calm and prepare to really think outside the box is a term that people throw around a lot, but really be prepared to, even if it's unexpected, to take links from things that you do already know about and sort of show them that you're thinking about what you already know in context. I think is really important.
Yeah, so I was going to say a couple of things. One of them was that I think we're going to touch on kind of mock interviews and that type of thing in a minute as well. But I think just this is quite obvious, but kind of Googling sample questions and then having people test you on them can be obviously really helpful. But also, I had friends kind of do practice interviews with me or ask me questions about things that could be very random. So I would be kind of in my art classroom and friends would test me on what I had to say about random things in the room. So doing things like that can actually help you think a bit more broadly, even if it's in a really informal setting. And also, I found that people doing practice interviews with you, even if they study very, very different subjects, can be really helpful. I had a girl who was applying for medicine do a practice interview with me for history of art, and it was really interesting. She asked me about things that I hadn't come across before because it was such a different perspective. Another thing that I did, this is more history of art specific, but I'm sure is kind of applicable to some others, is that so obviously you'll be asked questions that tend to be quite conceptual, but something that really helped me was having very, very clear examples kind of memorized. So for me, it was artworks that linked to different concepts, and I'd worked out kind of what they linked to in advance and made sure I had their date and name and kind of where they fell in it chronologically backed up, so that if I was talking about a concept that was a bit abstract, I could then bring in something very specific to make my argument a bit more concrete and also help me kind of ground what I was saying. And I think Ashley also said a lot about this already, but personal statement, both of my interviews, other than Unseen Images, were almost completely about my personal statement. And I made kind of some bold statements in them which I got pulled up on in both interviews and asked to back up, or whether I still had the same opinion that I had at the time of writing. So I think as long as you're prepared to talk about those things, and also if you know a bit more around the subjects that you bring up in your personal statement, which is kind of an obvious one, but you do want to make sure that you can talk about it for a more extended period, because both of the unseen images that I was given in my interviews were linked to the content in my personal statement. So it is really helpful to have kind of a really broad knowledge about the things that you reference in your personal statement, because you might find that the interviews are pretty focused on them, or it might not be, but it's always helpful to have that.
And I think the same goes for your written work, or if you've submitted, say, a portfolio, I'd say in the same way that you should read over your personal statement, look at your written work, look at your portfolio. They might say, we saw that you submitted written work about this area of history. Let's talk a bit about that because they've got proof that you know about that area of history. To Isabella, do you guys have anything to comment on for preparation?
No, I
Yeah,
think that
so
just, oh, sorry, you
sorry.
can go if you want.
Yeah, for history with mine, my interest in my personal statements were quite niche. So it meant that most of my interview was focused on the written work. So I think it's important that you're able to think beyond your A-level syllabus um, for that. And also pick something, if you can, an essay that you enjoy the stuff around it. And this is very specific for history, but on the faculty website, there's really good practice questions and sources, which I found really useful for the source part of the interview. So it's good to look at things you've never looked at before and trying to analyze something that maybe you don't have much other knowledge on. And I found that quite helpful for my interview.
Great, thank you. I didn't know that was a thing. If you're able to find a link and put it in the chat, would you be able to do that actually?
Yeah.
Great, amazing. And over Isabella, do you have something to add?
No, I was just going to kind of reiterate what's already been said. I definitely think for geography, it's quite an interdisciplinary subject. So definitely the final point about the affairs is really relevant. And I remember in mine, COP had just happened because it always happens around the same kind of time, and interviews at December time. And at the time when I had my interview, they were talking about loss and damage repayments at COP, and then that got brought up in the discussion. I think it's really important that if you have been keeping up with the affairs, you actually also need to know what it means and like the implications and the transferability of that, and not that you kind of just know the terminology, because they will push you on that, and then they might ask further questions on equity and things. So if you do bring something up, make sure that you have knowledge about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering if any of you were interviewed by somebody who actually wasn't teaching in your subject. So I know that sometimes we might have like our MML DOS will sometimes help with the English interviews. I think this year we have people from like music helping out with other subjects. I was wondering if that happened to any of you and whether the questions therefore that were asked were a bit more broader, just to give people an idea of some kind of strange subjects that might be strange questions that might be asked.
That happened to me. So I had two interviews, which is quite common of geography. And just if anyone's curious, it's not necessarily just human or just physical geography. It can be a real mix. And I definitely experienced that. So my first interview was with a geography professor and then PhD student in, I don't know, maybe plant science or something random, which is loosely connected. And then my second interview was with a theologian and a historian. So I think my second interview in particular really threw me off. And an example of one question that I got asked was about the morality of gift giving. And I think geography is quite a broad subject, so you can link that, but that really did push me out. And then I also got given a poem, but I got given the poem within the interview. So they put it in the text box, and then I had like a minute to read over it. Say if that does happen to you, don't stress that you're not reading it fast enough. Like they're not assessing the ability for you to read the poem. It's more like your understanding of it. And if that does take you a few minutes, that's okay. It's better that you have, a solid answer rather than just rushing it to read in 30 seconds and produce something. I think you just have to acknowledge the silence. Within that interview, I did end up kind of getting into a little bit of an argument with the historian. He had a different understanding of like symbiosis and then like symbiotic relationships to what I understood it as. But I think if you interpret it in one way and that's kind of valid in your context, as long as you argue that, it's all right. And I think I felt a bit more confident doing that just because you didn't study the subject. But that might not necessarily always be the case. So I wouldn't say like box your interviews into certain areas, especially with geography. Don't anticipate that it will be physical and human. Just be open to what they ask you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on just so we have time for the Q&A. And I have seen that there's lots of questions in the chat, so I will come back to them at the end of the Q&A session. I'm just going to try and whiz through these first. So on the day, try to remain calm. I know it's easier said than done. And you will regret some of your answers. The ambassadors today, they know that these questions were coming. They've been able to think about them. You probably will not give as polished an answer as some of the ambassadors are able to do now. You're in a really high pressure environment. And the academics know this. They know that you're nervous. They know that you're going to regret some things you said. You're going to walk out and say, "Why didn't I mention this? Like I knew this question, or I knew to analyze this." So don't worry about it. Everybody will be like that, and we take everything that you say with a bit of a pinch of salt because we know that you would not be like this if you weren't this stressed. Um, and try not to memorize things too much and then have to feel like you have to recall them. Like Isabella was saying, there may be things that happened very recently that you might want to reference. You might think, yeah, it would be really good to bring up this thing that happened recently in the news, but it's more about, make it relevant, make sure that it's, actually applicable to what they're asking you, rather than saying, oh, I need to show that I'm interested. I need to show that I've read this party's manifesto, for example, and then parrot it back because if it's not relevant to question, it might look too rehearsed. So know these things, but if they don't come up, you just have to kind of think, oh, I had so much else to say, but they weren't relevant to the questions. And do take your time. You're very, welcome to say, can I just have a minute to kind of think about this? Let me just think through it. Don't feel like Isabella was saying again, if they give you something to read, you have to whiz through it and they're judging you on that. Take your time, make sure you understand what they're actually asking you to do. Now, some people have asked about some practice questions in the chat and some mocks. These are some mocks I found online. Now, these are done by Cambridge University, and if you just go on YouTube and you typed in Cambridge University interview, and they are made by a college or they're made by a Cambridge department, I think they are probably quite legit, and I would recommend using them. If they're made by somebody else, I would maybe stay clear of them because they're not the kind of people interviewing you. Now, this one of them is quite generic. One of them's geography, one of them's MML. And if you were to apply to say geography or MML, I would maybe watch these when you have a good period of time, and then after they've asked the question, pause it and have a go at answering that yourself. So, just talk to the computer and then unpause it to see how the student responded. And you could use that as a bit of your own mock interview. I know that the students often do that, and it's quite useful just to see how would I respond, without knowing the questions in advance. You can take a photo here to get the QR codes, but even if you just go on YouTube and search for some mock interviews, as long as they're made by the university, I think they're quite good quality. Now, if you get offered a mock interview, say at your school, I wouldn't say, I would say that it's probably worth taking up the opportunity because some schools do offer them. I would advise against paying for a mock interview from a private organisation. It's not going to be the same as the Cambridge interview. I had a mock interview at my school and it was not very similar to my interview here. It might just be good preparation to see how you do, thinking off the top of your head to build some of your confidence, but the questions are not going to be that similar, so I wouldn't pay for one. And if you don't get to arrange a mock interview, you can do like what Jennifer was saying, ask a friend, pick apart things like your personal statement to ask you some things about your subject. That's going to prepare you just as well as doing a mock interview with someone at your school. But don't do it too much that you get to, rehearsing answers like I was saying, or kind of saying things that sound too pre-prepared. So just, know your personal statement, get some friends to question you over it, so you're used to thinking out loud. But once you feel confident enough with that, I say call it a day. Did any of you guys have mock interviews? Did you think they were useful?
I had a mock interview. This was just provided by my school. And if anything, it actually made the real interview much more pleasurable because my teacher was quite petrifying. And she asked like kind of quite personal questions, which I mean, I don't know, but from my personal experience and speaking to others, they don't tend to ask you personal questions. It's not like an American kind of process where it's like talk about a challenge and that kind of thing. It's very much emphasis on the academics. But I actually enjoyed the real interview much more.
Anybody else?
I had a couple of mock interviews from different people at my school. One of them was really, really useful, which was kind of, it was unseen images and then comparing them. And he was someone he was a recent Oxford graduate, so had a really good understanding of kind of the interview process, and had gone through it himself. So that was really, really helpful. And I felt was actually quite similar to the real process. But then I had another one with teachers who kind of, because my subject wasn't taught on my school, so I had teachers from a bunch of different subjects all interview me at once, which was a bit stressful and didn't really resemble my real interview. So I think with the mock interviews, like Isabella was saying, kind of take them with a pinch of salt because they might not always have the strongest basis in kind of knowing exactly what the interviews are like. But they can definitely be helpful for kind of practicing talking through ideas and just getting comfortable talking about your subject as well, I think is helpful.
Yeah, because in my school, the drama teacher did helped us with mock interviews, so it was just more about getting more help practice speaking than anything else.
Okay, so any kind of parting words of wisdom from any of the ambassadors before we get onto the Q&A? Any things that we haven't mentioned so far that you think would be really useful to know?
Yeah, I'm trying to answer the questions on the chat box that would I be disadvantaged in my interview for HSPS if I haven't studied any of the disciplines before? I would say no. You will not be getting like disadvantaged, but you should go through some of the like key themes in sociology, in politics, or in anthropology. In my I do A levels, and I only did sociology, which is relevant for HSPS. I did not take politics or anthropology because my school does not offer these two A level subjects. But I do go through a lot of like websites, even like Wikipedia or just general websites. You can Google it and you can find out some of the key themes in these disciplines and key theories, key perspectives, which you would be just getting familiar with them, and that's enough.
Thank you very much. Someone's actually just asked for module details for HSBS. Would you be able to get up the page with all the different modules, Ashley? I know it's on the HSBS website, just to send through while I'm moderating this. If you're not able to, I can probably find it after the webinar. Anybody else have any kind of words of wisdom, any advice?
I just genuinely think enjoy it and take it as an opportunity to have a discussion on something that actually maybe uh, is entirely different to what you've thought of before. And I've seen a few comments about like, what if you're uncertain? That's totally okay. And as Tess has previously said, like you don't need to have the right answers. It's just how you go about kind of reaching that. So don't be stressed and just relax because they're not actually scary. They want you to do well. So I just say enjoy it. And I think if you enjoy it, like the best version of yourself comes through.
And also, I want to add another point is that if you get a question that you feel like it is completely nonsense, you don't know how to answer the question, try to think about why you are thinking in this way. Is it any particular term in the question that you are just not familiar with? Or is it that, for example, given a sociological questions or a question that like tests that has something to do with the reality, is it that you are lacking empirical evidence? If so, you can speak that aloud to the interviewer. Try to just talk to them, keep the conversation going on. And even if it means talking to them why you think this question is so hard for me, um, and try to bring about any ideas from your mind. Do not keep the, do not make the interview feel like it's silent.
Great. Right, I'm gonna stop the recording now and move on to the Q&A so that we can answer some of the questions. I can see there's quite a lot of